Alright, so in this video we're going to talk about the cerebellum or hindbrain. Now what's fascinating about the cerebellum is that it's only 11% of your brain's mass, but it has about 2/3 of your brain's neurons. So it processes input from your cortex, brainstem, and sensory receptors. And because of all this processing of information, you need a lot of different neurons to provide precise coordinated movements of skeletal muscle. So when you think about your cerebellum, it's an entire portion of your brain that's dedicated to movement. Now it's located just dorsal or posterior to the pons and medulla and plays a major role in balance. So when you look at the anatomy of your cerebellum, you find that it's got hemispheres just like your cerebrum. So you have cerebellar hemispheres that are connected by this vermis. There's folia, which are like the gyri in your cerebrum. Each hemisphere has 3 lobes. We have anterior, posterior, and flocculonodular. And it contains a thin cortex of gray matter with a distinctive tree-like pattern deeper called arbor vitae. So if you looked at a cross-section here of the cerebellum, first of all, you can see it's just posterior to the brainstem. And on the brainstem here, you can see your midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. You can see your cerebral aqueduct going down into the 4th ventricle, which is here. And all of this posterior to the 4th ventricle is the cerebellum. Now, the cortex of the cerebellum doesn't have gyri. Instead, we actually have folia. Now, the folia are like the small folds on the outer surface of the cerebellum, but we still have sulci. So the inner folds of the sulci, where the folia would be the hills. And you can see that the white matter branching pattern of your cerebellum, all of this that kind of looks like a tree, is the white matter of your cerebellum. We call this arbor vitae, which actually means tree of life. Now, looking at the posterior view of the cerebellum, we can see those lobes. You have the anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and then a little bit more anterior to that would be flocculonodular, kind of up in here. Now, the vermis is what separates the 2 cerebellar hemispheres. So you'd have your right and your left cerebellar hemispheres. And all the fibers in the cerebellum are ipsilateral, which means they're from the same side of the body. Now, there are 3 paired fiber tracts that connect the cerebellum to the brainstem, and this is ultimately how the cerebellum communicates with the rest of the brain. Otherwise, it would function as its own little independent unit of brain matter. So we have the superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles, and they're named for their location. And if you think about the location of the brainstem, it makes sense. So the superior cerebellar peduncle connects to the midbrain, which is the superior most part of the brainstem. The middle cerebellar peduncle connects to the pons, which is in the middle part of the brainstem, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle connects to the medulla oblongata, which is even the most inferior most of the brainstem. Now, you can see these peduncles on this picture here, where we have the superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles, and they're basically white matter tracts that connect the midbrain to the cerebellum, the pons to the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata to the cerebellum. Now, by having all these connections, it allows for the cerebellum to communicate with the rest of the brain and then undergo the arduous task of maintaining balance, coordinating very skilled movements, and ensuring very precise activities. So the cerebellum ultimately is involved with fine-tuning motor activity. Earlier we talked about how planning of motor movements occurred in the premotor cortex of your frontal lobe, but that's a very kind of just imprecise type of activity. So you might plan to grab a coffee mug, and you can actually initiate that movement by using the primary motor cortex, but ultimately it's the cerebellum that would fine-tune that motor activity. So it's going to receive impulses from your cortex and help initiate voluntary muscle contraction, and also receive signals from the proprioceptors around your body. That way the cerebellum can get input about where your body currently is, so that as you're carrying out the action, it can help to finely tune that activity. That way you can carry out the goal. So these pathways continuously inform the cerebellum of your body's position and its momentum or movement. Now, the cerebellar cortex calculates the best way to smoothly coordinate muscle contraction. And what's pretty cool here too is that the cerebellum sends a blueprint of coordinated movement to the motor cortex and the brainstem, so that those brain regions can also help carry out these precise motor movements.